He gave his only coat to a freezing woman at a desolate train stop in the dead of winter, never imagining she owned half the railroad that ran through the entire West. A broken cowboy with nothing left to lose. A powerful stranger shivering in the snow. One act of kindness in the bitter cold of Wyoming territory would change both their lives forever, leading to love, redemption, and a legacy that would echo across the frontier for generations to come. What started as a simple gesture at Copper Ridge Station became the story that reminded an entire territory what it truly means to be human. This is that story. The wind howled across the Wyoming territory like a wounded animal, cutting through Copper Ridge with a fury that made even the hardiest souls retreat indoors. Snow fell thick and relentless, blanketing the frontier town in white silence, muffling the usual sounds of horses, wagon wheels, and distant train whistles. At the edge of town, beneath the weathered overhang of Copper Ridge Station, stood Jack Dutch Holloway. 43 years old, broad-shouldered but worn thin by hardship, he clutched a battered leather satchel close to his chest. Inside were 6 letters, 6 rejections from ranches across the territory. No work, no prospects, no future. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the freezing night air. The clock above the station platform read 8:30. The train was late, as it often was in weather like this. Dutch had once been somebody. Foreman at the Double Creek Ranch, one of the finest cattle operations in Wyoming. He'd had a wife, Emma, with a smile that could warm the coldest winter morning, and a boy, Samuel, who had her eyes and his stubborn chin. They weren't rich, but they had each other, and that had been enough. Then the fever came, swept through town like wildfire 3 years back. Emma fought it for 2 weeks before her body gave out. Dutch had held her hand till the very end, whispering promises he didn't know if he could keep. After that, everything crumbled. He'd left his job to care for her, burned through their savings on medicine that didn't work, sold their small homestead to pay the debts. He and Sam moved from place to place, sleeping in barns, boarding houses, eventually in an old prospector's shack on the outskirts of town. Dutch had tried. God knows he'd tried. He worked odd jobs, breaking horses, mending fences, hauling freight. But it was never enough, never steady. And when winter came hard last year, when Sam got sick and Dutch couldn't afford proper care, the Reverend had stepped in. "The boy needs stability," Reverend Matthews had said, his voice kind but firm. "A warm bed, regular meals, schooling. You can't give him that right now." Dutch hadn't argued. He'd looked at his son, pale and shivering in a coat 2 sizes too small, and he'd known the Reverend was right. So he'd signed the papers, hugged Sam tight, and made a promise through his tears. "Just for now, son. I'll come back for you, I swear it." That was 4 months ago. Since then, Dutch had been living in an abandoned mining camp, sleeping in what used to be the foreman's shack, a single room with gaps in the walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. He spent his days looking for work, any work, trying to build something stable enough to bring Sam home. Tonight had been his last hope. The Harrison Ranch, 20 miles north, had been hiring. But when Dutch arrived, the foreman took one look at his worn clothes and weathered face and shook his head. "Got 3 younger men already lined up, Holloway. Sorry." Now Dutch stood at the station, waiting for a train that would take him nowhere in particular. He had 17 cents in his pocket, a coat that had seen better years, and a heart that felt like it might finally be ready to give up. The snow kept falling, the cold seeped deeper, and Dutch wondered, not for the first time, if he'd ever feel warm again. He looked down at the satchel in his hands and opened it slowly. Tucked inside, beneath the rejection letters, was a folded piece of paper. He pulled it out carefully, unfolding it with cold, stiffened fingers. It was a drawing, done in charcoal by a child's hand. 2 stick figures standing side by side beneath a crooked sun. One labeled Pa, the other Me. At the bottom, in uneven letters, "I miss you, Pa. Love, Sam." Dutch's throat tightened. He folded the drawing carefully and tucked it back into his coat pocket, close to his heart. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw her. She appeared through the snowfall like a ghost, moving quickly but unsteadily across the platform. Dutch noticed her immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was so clearly unprepared for the merciless Wyoming cold. Mid-30s, he guessed, dressed in a fine traveling dress of deep burgundy, the kind wealthy folks from back east wore. But no coat, no shawl, no gloves. Her dark hair, which had likely been pinned up properly earlier, now hung loose and wet against her face. Her arms were wrapped tight around herself, hands trembling violently. She stumbled slightly on the icy platform, caught herself, then made her way under the same overhang where Dutch stood. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, visible in the frozen air. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Dutch looked away. Not his business. He had his own troubles, his own cold to endure. But then the wind picked up with a vengeance, howling across the platform like a banshee. The woman gasped and turned away from it, curling into herself, and Dutch heard her teeth chattering from 6 feet away. He glanced at her again. She was rubbing her bare hands together frantically, trying to create warmth that wouldn't come. Her whole body shook. Dutch looked down at his coat. It wasn't much. Worn brown leather with frayed cuffs, patches on the elbows, the sheepskin lining thin from years of use. But it was all he had, the only thing standing between him and the brutal cold. He could keep it, should keep it. He had nothing else, nowhere to go, no one to help him if he froze. But he couldn't. Something in him, some stubborn piece of who he used to be, wouldn't let him watch someone suffer when he could do something about it. Without a word, Dutch shrugged off the coat. The cold hit him instantly, knifing through his thin work shirt like it was made of paper. He stepped toward the woman and held the coat out. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide. "No," she said quickly, her voice refined despite the shivering. "No, you don't need to." "You're freezing, ma'am," Dutch said simply. His voice was rough from disuse, but gentle. "So are you," she protested, but her eyes betrayed her. They were locked on the coat, like it was salvation itself. "I've been colder," Dutch lied. He stepped closer and carefully draped the coat over her shoulders before she could refuse again. The woman pulled it around herself instinctively, and Dutch saw the relief flood her face immediately. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them again, they were glistening. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." Dutch just nodded, already folding his arms tight against his chest, trying to keep what little warmth he had left. They stood in silence for a moment, the snow continuing to fall around them, the wind still howling its lonely song. "What's your name?" she asked finally, pulling the coat tighter. "Dutch Holloway, ma'am." "I'm Margaret Brennan." She paused. "But most folks call me Maggie." "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Brennan." Maggie looked at him more carefully now, taking in his worn clothes. The satchel clutched against his chest, the weariness etched deep in his face. "Do you have somewhere warm to go tonight?" Dutch's jaw tightened. "Somewhere," he said, not elaborating. He wasn't about to tell this refined Eastern lady that somewhere was a broken-down shack with holes in the walls. In the distance, the sound of a train whistle cut through the storm. Maggie glanced toward the tracks, then back at Dutch. She reached into a small beaded purse at her side and pulled out a card. "Here," she said, pressing it into his cold hand. "If you ever need anything at all." Dutch looked down at the card, but in the dim light and swirling snow, he couldn't make out the words. He slipped it into his satchel without reading it. "Thank you, ma'am, but I'll be all right." The train's headlamp appeared through the snow, growing brighter. Maggie stood, still wrapped in his coat, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and sorrow. "Take care of yourself, Dutch Holloway," she said softly. "You too, ma'am." The train screeched to a halt, steam hissing into the frozen air. Maggie stepped toward it, then looked back one last time. Dutch raised a hand in farewell. She boarded, and the train pulled away moments later, disappearing into the white darkness of the Wyoming night. Dutch stood alone on the platform, shivering violently now, the cold biting through to his bones. He looked up at the sky, then down at the empty tracks. Then he turned and walked into the storm, toward the abandoned mining camp, toward another night of cold and hunger and loneliness. But something felt different, something small, quiet, almost like hope. The train car was warm, almost stifling after the brutal cold of the platform. Maggie Brennan sat in her private compartment, still wrapped tightly in the stranger's coat, watching the snow-covered landscape rush past the window. She should have felt relieved. The meeting in Copper Ridge had gone well. Another contract signed. Another section of track secured. The Central and Pacific Railroad was expanding faster than anyone had predicted, and she was at the center of it all. But all she could think about was the man on the platform, Dutch Holloway, the way he'd given up his only coat without hesitation, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of losses too heavy to name, the quiet dignity he carried despite having nothing. Maggie pulled the coat closer, breathing in the scent of leather, wood smoke, and something else, the faint smell of soap, like he'd tried to wash away the hardship even when it was all he had left. Her fingers brushed against something in the inside pocket. Curious, she reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the creases, handled often. She unfolded it carefully. The drawing stopped her breath. 2 stick figures, drawn in charcoal by a child's uncertain hand. One tall, one small, standing side by side beneath a sun with uneven rays. Labels beneath them, Pa and Me, at the bottom, in letters that slanted and wobbled. I miss you, Pa. Love, Sam. Maggie stared at the paper, her hands beginning to tremble, not from cold this time, but from something deeper. She read the words again and again. I miss you, Pa. This wasn't just some drifter who'd been kind. This was a father separated from his child, carrying this drawing close to his heart like a talisman, a father who had nothing left but still chose to give. Maggie's throat tightened, her eyes burned. She looked around her private compartment, the velvet seats, the polished wood paneling, the crystal lamp casting warm light, everything carefully designed, perfectly arranged, completely empty of life. There were no drawings on her walls, no photographs, no personal touches of any kind. Just success, just business, just the cold machinery of ambition. Maggie folded the drawing carefully and held it against her chest. Then, without warning, the tears came. She hadn't cried in years, not since she was a girl, 12 years old, alone, and freezing on the steps of a church in Kansas City. She'd run away from another cruel foster home, wandered the streets until nightfall, finally collapsed on those stone steps in the middle of winter, shivering and hopeless, certain she would die there. Then he'd found her, an old prospector named Silas Kane, weathered and grizzled, smelling of tobacco and trail dust. He'd taken off his coat, a heavy buffalo hide that probably cost him a month's earnings, and wrapped it around her small shoulders. "Can't have you freezing out here, little miss," he'd said, his voice gravel rough but kind. "World's hard enough without the cold taking you too." He'd sat with her all night, keeping watch, asking no questions. In the morning, he'd walked her to the orphanage, pressed $2 silver into her hand and told her, "You're going to be something special someday. Don't you forget it." She never saw him again. But that moment, that single act of kindness from a stranger who had nothing, had saved her life, not just physically, but something deeper. It had shown her that she mattered, that she was worth saving. Everything she'd built since then, every risk she'd taken, every contract she'd fought for, every mile of railroad track she'd laid, had been driven by the memory of that night. And now, 23 years later, someone else had done the same thing, given everything when they had nothing. Maggie wiped her eyes and looked down at the drawing again, at the simple words written by a child's hand. "I miss you, Pa." She stood abruptly and walked to the door of her compartment, opening it to find her assistant, Theodore Walsh, reading a newspaper in the adjoining space. "Theodore," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks, I need you to find someone for me." He looked up, immediately attentive. "Of course, Miss Brennan." "Who?" "His name is Dutch Holloway. He was at Copper Ridge Station tonight." "I need to know everything about him, where he lives, where he works, what happened to his son." Theodore's eyebrows raised slightly, but he simply nodded. "I'll have our people start looking immediately." "And Theodore?" Maggie held up the drawing. "This is important. Maybe the most important thing I've ever asked you to do." He met her eyes and saw something there he'd never seen before. Not in all the years he'd worked for the railroad magnate known for her ice-cold business decisions. He saw her heart, finally cracked open. "I understand, Miss Brennan. We'll find him." Maggie returned to her seat, still wrapped in Dutch's coat, still holding Sam's drawing. And for the first time in 23 years, she let herself feel the full weight of gratitude, grief, and hope all tangled together. Outside, the train carried her through the snow-covered darkness, but her mind was already racing back to that platform, to the man who'd reminded her what it meant to be human. She would find him, and somehow she would repay what could never truly be repaid. 3 days later, Dutch was hauling timber at a lumber camp 5 miles outside Copper Ridge, when a man in a fine black suit appeared at the edge of the worksite. Theodore Walsh stood out like a sore thumb among the rough-clothed workers. Polished shoes, pressed suit, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. He scanned the men working until his eyes landed on Dutch, bent over a stack of logs, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold. "Mr. Holloway?" Theodore called out. Dutch looked up, confused. Nobody called him Mr. anymore. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. "That's me." Theodore approached, picking his way carefully across the muddy, wood-chip-covered ground. "My name is Theodore Walsh. I work for the Central and Pacific Railroad. Miss Margaret Brennan sent me to find you." Dutch's brow furrowed. The name meant nothing to him. "I think you got the wrong man. Copper Ridge Station. 3 nights ago, you gave a woman your coat." Recognition flickered across Dutch's face, followed quickly by confusion. "Maggie? Is she all right? Did something—" "She's perfectly well," Theodore assured him. "In fact, she'd very much like to see you. She's waiting at the Copper Ridge Hotel." Dutch looked down at himself, covered in sawdust and mud, smelling of sweat and pine. "Now? I can't I'm working. I've already spoken with your foreman. You're excused for the day, with pay." Dutch stared at him. "Why would she want to see me?" Theodore's expression softened slightly. "That's something she'd prefer to explain herself. If you'll come with me." 20 minutes later, Dutch found himself standing in the lobby of the finest hotel in Copper Ridge, a place he'd walked past 100 times but never imagined entering. The floors were polished wood, a chandelier hung from the ceiling, and everything smelled of expensive cigars and rosewater. He felt completely out of place. Theodore led him to a private sitting room on the 2nd floor and knocked gently. "Miss Brennan, Mr. Holloway is here." The door opened, and there she was. Maggie looked different in the daylight. Dressed in a fine navy traveling suit, her dark hair pinned up properly. But her eyes, those same eyes that had looked at him with such gratitude on the platform, were exactly as he remembered. "Dutch," she said softly and smiled. "Ma'am." He removed his hat, suddenly very aware of how he must look. "Mr. Walsh here said you wanted to see me?" "Yes, please, come in. Sit." Dutch hesitated, then entered the room. It was furnished with upholstered chairs, a small table set with tea and coffee, curtains that probably cost more than he'd made in the last year. He remained standing. "Is everything all right? With the coat, I mean. You can keep it, I didn't expect—" "Dutch." Maggie stepped closer. "I didn't ask you here about the coat." "Well, not exactly." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Dutch's heart stopped. It was Sam's drawing. "This fell out of your coat pocket," Maggie said gently. "I wanted to return it to you. I imagine it's quite precious." Dutch took it with shaking hands, staring down at his son's crooked letters, the stick figures that haunted his dreams. I didn't realize." His voice cracked. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for you to. Don't apologize. Maggie's voice was thick with emotion. This drawing. Dutch, do you know what you did for me that night? He looked up at her, confused. You gave me your only coat. Not knowing who I was, not asking for anything in return. You had nothing, and you still gave. She paused, composing herself. Do you know where your son is now? The question hit him like a punch. He's with Reverend Matthews at the church home. He swallowed hard. I couldn't take care of him proper, not yet. Maggie nodded slowly. And you're living where? Dutch looked away. Old mining camp, outside town, working at the lumber yard? When I can get the work. Some days hauling freight, fixing fences, whatever comes. Maggie studied him for a long moment. This man who'd lost everything, who'd been separated from his child, who slept in an abandoned shack, and still, when he saw someone in need, he'd given the coat off his back. Dutch, I need to tell you something. That night at the station, I wasn't just some traveler passing through. He waited. I own half the Central and Pacific Railroad. I'm one of the wealthiest women in the Wyoming Territory. She let that sink in. And you gave me your coat without knowing any of that, without wanting anything in return. Dutch stood very still, processing this information. Why are you telling me this? He asked quietly. Maggie stepped closer. Because I want to give you something in return. Not as payment. What you did can't be paid back. But as a chance, a real chance. Dutch shook his head slowly. Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but I don't take charity. This isn't charity, Maggie interrupted firmly. This is something else entirely. She gestured to the chair. Please, sit, let me explain. Reluctantly, Dutch sat down, still clutching his hat and Sam's drawing, and Maggie began to tell him about an offer that would change everything. Maggie sat across from Dutch and slid a leather folder across the table. He stared at it like it might bite him. Open it, she said gently. Dutch set down his hat and Sam's drawing, then opened the folder with calloused hands. Inside were several typed pages, official-looking documents with the Central and Pacific Railroad letterhead embossed in gold at the top. He scanned the words, but they didn't quite make sense. Position, salary, benefits, housing stipend. I don't understand, he said finally. Maggie leaned forward. I'm offering you a job, Dutch. A real job, with the railroad. He looked up sharply. Doing what? I haven't worked rail in 15 years, and even then I was just... Not that kind of work, she interrupted. Something different, something new. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm creating a position, community relations officer. Someone who works with our crews, our station masters, our expansion camps. Someone who ensures we're not just building a railroad, but building it with heart, with humanity. Dutch stared at her. You want me to talk to people? I want you to remind people what matters, to help us see the workers not as labor, but as men with families, with struggles, with dignity. Her voice grew more passionate. The railroad is growing faster than we can manage. We're hiring hundreds of men, moving them across the territory, and we're losing sight of them as human beings. I don't want that. Not anymore. Dutch shook his head slowly. Miss Brennan, I'm not educated. I can't read fancy reports or sit in boardrooms with... I don't need you to read reports, Maggie said firmly. I need you to do what you did at that station, to see someone suffering and care enough to do something about it. Dutch looked down at the papers again. The salary listed was more than he'd made in 3 good years combined. Enough to rent a house. Enough to bring Sam home. His chest tightened. This is charity, he said quietly. Dressed up fancy, but that's what it is. It's not... Ma'am, I appreciate what you're trying to do. I truly do, but I can't accept this. He pushed the folder back toward her. I don't deserve it. Maggie's eyes flashed. Why not? Because I'm nobody. The words burst out of him, raw and painful. I'm a broke-down cowboy who lost everything. I couldn't save my wife, couldn't keep my son, couldn't even hold down steady work, You think giving me a fancy title is going to change that? I think you're more than you believe you are." Dutch stood abruptly, grabbing his hat. "I gave you a coat, Miss Brennan. That's all. It doesn't make me special, doesn't make me qualified for whatever this is. You want to help me? Fine. But don't pretend this is about me being useful. We both know better." Maggie stood as well, her voice rising to match his. "You think I built this railroad on pity? On sentiment? I didn't get here by making foolish decisions, Dutch Holloway." "Then don't start now." He gestured at the folder. "Find someone who actually belongs in your world. Someone who won't embarrass you when you realize you made a mistake." They stood facing each other, both breathing hard, the air between them charged with frustration and something deeper, fear, hope, and the terrible vulnerability of being truly seen. Maggie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Come with me. Just for an hour. Let me show you something." Dutch shook his head. "Miss Brennan." "1 hour," she pressed. "Then if you still want to walk away, I won't stop you. I'll never bother you again. But please, just give me 1 hour." Dutch looked at her, this wealthy, powerful woman who could have anyone working for her, who could solve her problems with money or influence, but instead was standing here practically begging a broken-down cowboy to give her a chance. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, to protect himself from the inevitable disappointment, he heard himself say, 1 hour. Maggie's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. But I'm not promising anything," Dutch added firmly. "I know." Theodore appeared at the door with Dutch's coat, the same worn leather coat, freshly cleaned and mended. Maggie had kept it, cared for it. Dutch took it slowly, running his fingers over the repairs. Someone had stitched the frayed cuffs, replaced a missing button, treated the leather. "Couldn't let it fall apart," Maggie said softly. "It saved my life." Dutch didn't respond. He just pulled on the coat and followed her out into the cold Wyoming morning, his heart a confusing tangle of resistance and desperate, terrifying hope. They rode in silence through Copper Ridge, then out along the western road. Dutch sat stiffly in the railroad carriage, watching the familiar landscape roll past. The same hills and frozen creeks he'd wandered, looking for work, the same unforgiving territory that had broken him piece by piece. After 30 minutes, they pulled up in front of a modest building on the edge of town. It was sturdy, well built, with a fresh coat of white paint and a sign above the door that read, "The Frontier Hope House." Dutch frowned. "What is this place?" "Come inside," Maggie said. The moment Dutch stepped through the door, he was hit with warmth, not just from the pot-bellied stove in the corner, but from something else. The sound of children laughing, the smell of fresh bread, the feeling of life. The walls were covered with children's drawings, handprints in paint, carved wooden animals hanging from strings. There was a long table where several kids sat doing schoolwork, a play area with handmade toys, and a kitchen where an older woman was pulling biscuits from an oven. Miss Brennan, a young girl, maybe 6 years old, ran up and hugged Maggie's skirts. "You came back." Maggie smiled and knelt down. "Of course I did, Sarah. I promised, didn't I?" She looked up at Dutch. "Sarah, this is Mr. Holloway. Can you say hello?" The girl looked at Dutch with big, curious eyes. "Hello, Mr. Holloway. Do you like biscuits?" Despite himself, Dutch smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Come on, then." Sarah grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the kitchen. Over the next hour, Maggie walked Dutch through the house. She introduced him to the woman who ran it, Mrs. Colleen Hayes, a widow who'd lost her own children to scarlet fever and now devoted her life to caring for others. "We take in orphans, children from struggling families, anyone who needs a safe place," Mrs. Hayes explained. "Miss Brennan here, she built this whole place, pays for everything, food, clothes, schooling, medicine." Dutch looked at Maggie. "You did this?" Maggie nodded. "The house is named after someone who saved my life when I was 12 years old." They moved to a quieter corner, away from the children. Maggie gestured to a bench by the window, and they sat. "I never told you my story," Maggie began, her voice quiet. "I grew up in foster homes. moved from place to place. Kansas City mostly. Some homes were kind. Others, she paused. Others weren't. Dutch listened, his full attention on her. When I was 12, I ran away. It was winter, bitter cold, like the night we met. I ended up on the steps of a church, freezing, certain I was going to die there. Her eyes grew distant. Then an old prospector found me. A man named Silas Kane. He took off his coat, this heavy buffalo hide that was probably worth everything he owned, and wrapped it around me. Dutch's breath caught. He sat with me all night. Didn't ask questions, didn't lecture me, just stayed. In the morning, he walked me to an orphanage, gave me $2 silver, and told me I was going to be something special. Maggie's voice wavered. I never saw him again. But that moment, that one act of kindness from a stranger who had nothing, it changed everything. She turned to face Dutch fully. I built this railroad, built my fortune, built this house, all because someone saw me suffering and chose to help, not because he had to, not because he'd get something in return, just because it was right. Dutch felt his throat tighten. And last week, Maggie continued, at that train station, you did the exact same thing. You reminded me of him, of what it means to give when you have nothing left to give. Dutch looked around the room, at the children playing, the warmth, the safety, the love built into every corner. You think I don't belong in your world, Maggie said gently. But Dutch, you are my world. You're the reason this world exists. She reached out and took his hand. That railroad job isn't charity, it's necessity. Because somewhere along the way, I forgot. I got so caught up in expansion and profit and success that I forgot what actually matters. Dutch stared down at their hands, hers soft and clean, his rough and scarred. I don't know if I can do this, he whispered. You already have been, Maggie said. You've just been doing it alone, in the cold, with no one seeing you. I'm just asking you to do it where it can actually make a difference, where you can help others the way you helped me. A tear slipped down Dutch's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. My son, he said, his voice breaking. I promised him I'd come back for him. Maggie squeezed his hand. Then come back for him. The job comes with housing. A real home, Dutch. Big enough for both of you. Dutch closed his eyes, and the dam finally broke. Years of grief, of loss, of carrying unbearable weight alone. It all came pouring out. He wept quietly, his shoulders shaking. Maggie didn't let go. She just held his hand and let him feel it, all of it. The pain, the hope, the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but clear. Okay, he whispered. Okay. 6 months later, Dutch Holloway stood in the main yard of the Central and Pacific Railroad's western hub, watching crews prepare for the day's work. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink. He wore a clean shirt, a leather vest, and boots that didn't have holes in them. But more than his appearance had changed, something in his bearing was different, lighter, more certain. Morning, Dutch, called out a young track layer named Billy, waving from across the yard. Morning, Billy. Remember what we talked about yesterday. Take breaks when you need them. Heat stroke doesn't care how tough you think you are. Billy grinned and nodded. Yes, sir. Dutch had been traveling between railroad camps and stations, doing exactly what Maggie had envisioned. He sat with the workers during meals, learned their names, heard their stories. When a crew member's wife fell ill, Dutch made sure the man got time off and connected him with a doctor. When tensions flared between Irish and Chinese workers, Dutch sat both groups down and helped them find common ground. He didn't give speeches or make grand declarations. He just listened, cared, and acted when he could. Word spread quickly. The railroad workers began seeking him out, not with complaints, but with struggles. A man whose child was sick, another who hadn't heard from his family in months, a young worker who admitted, voice shaking, that he was thinking of ending it all. To that young man, Dutch had said simply, "I know that darkness. I've stood in it, but you're not alone anymore. Let me help carry it with you." The young man had broken down, and Dutch had sat with him until dawn, just like Silas Kane had once done for Maggie. Back in Copper Ridge, Dutch's life had rebuilt itself in ways he'd never imagined. With Maggie's help and the housing stipend from his job, he'd purchased a small homestead just outside town. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a porch that faced the sunrise. And most importantly, Sam was home. Dutch would never forget the day he'd walked into Reverend Matthew's church, papers in hand, and said, "I've come for my son." Sam had looked up from his reading primer, eyes wide with disbelief. "Pa?" Dutch had knelt down, tears already streaming. "I told you I'd come back. I told you." Sam had run into his arms, and Dutch had held him like he'd never let go. Now every morning, Dutch made breakfast while Sam got ready for school. Every evening they sat on the porch and Sam told him about his day, about arithmetic lessons, about the new friend he'd made, about the drawing he'd done in art class. "I drew us again, Pa," Sam had said just last week, holding up a new picture, "but this time we're in front of our house." Our real house. Dutch had hung it on the wall next to the old drawing, the one he'd carried in his coat pocket through the darkest times. As for Maggie, she and Dutch had grown closer with each passing week. What had started as gratitude had deepened into friendship, and then into something neither of them had expected. They took walks together after work, talking about everything. Childhood memories, fears, dreams. They shared meals at the homestead, with Sam chattering away, while Maggie listened with genuine interest. She taught Sam about trains and business. Dutch taught her about fixing fences and reading the weather. One evening, as they sat on Dutch's porch watching the sunset, Maggie had rested her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd find this," she'd said softly. "Find what?" "Home, not a place, just home." Dutch had wrapped his arm around her, and they'd sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned purple and the first stars appeared. But the moment that truly showed Dutch how far he'd come happened on an ordinary Tuesday. A young railroad worker named James had pulled him aside, eyes red from crying. "Mr. Holloway, I need to tell you something." They'd sat on a stack of railroad ties away from the others. "I was going to leave," James said, voice breaking. "Not just the job. Everything. I had it all planned. But then I heard you talking last week about your son, about the dark times, about how you kept going even when you couldn't see the point." Dutch's heart clenched. "You said something that stuck with me. You said, the world gets darker when we leave it, but it gets brighter when we stay and light even one candle." James wiped his eyes. "I decided to stay. To be a candle instead of adding to the darkness." Dutch put a hand on the young man's shoulder, his own eyes wet. "I'm really glad you're still here, James." That night, Dutch sat at his kitchen table after Sam had gone to bed. He pulled out both drawings, the old one, worn and creased, and the new one, bright and hopeful. He'd spent so long believing he was broken, useless, finished, but he'd been wrong. He wasn't broken. He was just becoming something new. The main hall of the Central and Pacific Railroad headquarters had been transformed. Gone were the usual maps and schedules and business ledgers. In their place hung garlands of pine, strings of lanterns, and a massive banner that read, "A Legacy of Kindness." Railroad workers, station masters, office staff, and townspeople from Copper Ridge filled the room, dressed in their Sunday best. Children from the Frontier Hope House sat in the front rows, eyes wide with excitement. On the center stage stood a tall easel draped with cloth, and beside it, Maggie Brennan stepped up to the podium. She wore a deep green dress, her hair styled elegantly, but her eyes held the same warmth they'd had that night at the station. The room quieted. "A year ago," Maggie began, her voice steady and clear, "I was standing at Copper Ridge Station in the middle of a snowstorm. I was cold, freezing actually, and completely unprepared for the Wyoming winter." A few knowing chuckles rippled through the crowd. Then a man I'd never met did something I'll never forget. He took off his only coat and gave it to me. No questions asked, no payment expected, just simple, pure kindness. She paused, emotion flickering across her face. That coat didn't just warm my body that night. It thawed something in me I didn't even know had frozen. My ability to see people, really see them, beyond contracts and schedules and profit margins. Maggie turned toward the side of the stage. "Dutch, would you please join me?" Dutch stood from his seat in the front row, Sam beaming beside him. He walked up slowly, still uncomfortable with this kind of attention, his face slightly flushed. The crowd applauded as he took his place beside Maggie. "This man," Maggie continued, "reminded me that the railroad we're building isn't just about connecting cities or moving goods. It's about connecting people, caring for them, seeing their humanity." She reached beneath the podium and pulled out a wooden box, polished and beautiful. "Dutch, this belongs to you." He opened it carefully. Inside, preserved behind glass, was his old coat. The worn leather, the patched elbows, the frayed sheepskin lining, all carefully restored but authentically kept. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "One act of kindness can change the direction of a life. May we never forget." Dutch stared at it, his throat too tight to speak. "We're placing this in the main office," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion, "so that every person who works for this railroad remembers, we're not just building track. We're building a legacy of caring for one another." The applause thundered through the hall. Dutch nodded his thanks, unable to find words. Then he cleared his throat. I actually have something too." Surprised murmurs filled the room. Even Maggie looked curious. Dutch reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The room went completely silent. He turned to face Maggie fully, his hands trembling slightly. "You said that coat changed your life," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "But Maggie, you changed mine. You gave me back everything I thought I'd lost forever, my dignity, my purpose, my son." He glanced at Sam in the front row, who was grinning ear to ear. "And you gave me something I never expected to find again." He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone, the kind found in Wyoming territory, rough but beautiful. "It's not fancy," Dutch said, "but it's real, like us." Maggie's hand flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. "Margaret Brennan," Dutch said, his voice stronger now, "will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then Maggie laughed, a sound of pure joy, and nodded through her tears. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." The hall erupted. Cheers, applause, whistles, and hollers filled the air. Sam jumped up from his seat, pumping his fist. The children from Frontier Hope House squealed with delight. Dutch slipped the ring onto Maggie's finger, and she threw her arms around him. They held each other as the celebration swirled around them. Two people who'd found each other in the cold and built something warm together. 2 months later, they were married at the Frontier Hope House, the place where Dutch had finally understood he deserved a second chance. The ceremony was simple, but overflowing with meaning. Children scattered wildflowers down the aisle. Railroad workers stood alongside businessmen. Mrs. Hayes dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sam stood as his father's best man, proud and beaming. Maggie wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar, a wildflower crown in her hair. Dutch wore a new suit, but around his shoulders, just for the ceremony, he wore that old coat, the one that had started everything. During the vows, Maggie took Dutch's hands and looked into his eyes. "You gave me your coat when I was freezing," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Today I give you my whole life, my whole heart, every moment from here forward." Dutch's eyes glistened. "I didn't know I could feel this again. Joy, hope, love. You didn't just save my life, Maggie. You taught me how to live it." They kissed as husband and wife, and the room exploded with joy. The reception spilled out into the yard, where lanterns were hung in the trees, and a fiddle player struck up a lively tune. Dutch danced with Maggie, then with Sam, then with little Sarah from the Hope House, who stood on his boots as he waltzed her around. Later that evening, as the sun set over the Wyoming hills, a photographer captured a moment that would become legendary across the territory. Dutch and Maggie standing beneath the Frontier Hope House sign, Sam between them, and on an easel beside them, the preserved coat in its glass case, a symbol of where kindness can lead. That photograph would hang in railroad stations across the West, shared in newspapers, spoken of in stories around campfires. It became a reminder that even in the hardest times, even when you have nothing left, one act of kindness, one gesture of seeing another person suffering and choosing to help, can echo further than you ever imagined. Dutch Holloway had given his coat to a freezing stranger. In return, he found love, family, purpose, and a legacy that would outlive them both. Sometimes the smallest gesture can rewrite everything, and sometimes the people who've lost the most have the most to give. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that hope still lives in unexpected places, please like, share, and subscribe to Your Channel Name. Here we tell the tales that warm the heart, restore your faith in humanity, and remind us what truly matters. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing.